I work nights in the lab, which means the building teaches you its vocabulary whether you ask to learn it or not. By midnight the hospital speaks in airflow and relay clicks. The pneumatic tube system, ours is a translogic retrofit from 10 years ago, has its own accent, far-off whooshes, a soft thunk when a carrier kisses a station's bumpers, the little flittering sigh the diverter gates make when they change their minds. Blood comes to us that way, labels and requisitions, too. Day shift runs the tubes constantly. Night shift becomes the tube system's confidant. If you've never lived with tubes, picture a tangle of clear pipes arcing over ceiling tiles and slipping into walls, a nervous system you can hear more than you can see. Each station has an address that looks like a secret: LOB, Lab, 01, ED, A1, NICU, 02. The console behind my bench keeps score: route started, route completed, route rejected. Whoever wrote the UI believed in blocky fonts and certainty. The map lights up stations like a constellation chart. The biomed guys call the junction boxes brains, the diverters elbows. We call the whole thing the tube, singular, like a pet that lives in the ceiling and eats errands. At 0:53 my hands smelled like bleach and powdered gloves, and the tube went quiet enough for me to hear the centrifuge bearings argue. The last stat from ED had spun, results posted, the nurse would be back at the window in 5 minutes to snatch the sticker that made a transfusion real. I leaned on the counter and looked through the glass toward the service lobby, elevators asleep, echo of a floor machine somewhere down the hall, and felt the building check its own pockets the way all buildings do after midnight. The console made its bird beep and printed a skinny line: 054, arrive, Lab, 01, Ortho 01. That was wrong. Ortho 01 is on the 8th floor, North Annex, taped off for a modernization project. New headwall rails, new gas drops, new everything except nurses. Facilities had pulled the breaker on the station 2 weeks ago. I have a picture on my phone of Singh from Facilities with a panel open and the sort of neat wire nuts only Singh makes. Tag out, lock out. Ortho is napping, he'd said, and he'd hung a red tag that looked proud to be useful. Before I could decide whether to be impressed or annoyed, the Lab, 01 cradle thunked forward and a carrier bounced into the foam cradle like it had been a foot away the whole time. The lid had a gouge across the plexi small as a thumbnail, and the white felt ring around the cap had a crescent of dirt like an eyelash. When I popped it, the lid sighed cold. Not cold like refrigeration, cold like garage air after snow melt. The carrier was empty. The console threw a second line the way receipts fall out of pockets: empty arrival, NO payload. Sometimes stray carriers wander home on bypass loops after a jam clears downstream. You learn not to mythologize every quirk. I scrolled the log, looking for a jam. Nothing. Route start not found. Just an arrive, carrying a station name the map swore did not exist. I closed the lid and set the carrier on the bench like you might put down someone else's wallet before you decide whether to return it. On the far side of glass, the service elevator's position indicator blinked 1 to blank and back to 1 the way it does when somebody valley parks the car by holding the button too long. No one stepped out. The janitor's machine hummed somewhere closer now, like the ocean in a seashell. Behind me the console beeped again with the same even confidence, and the same line printed with one new number: 104, arrive, Lab, 01, Ortho 01. 2 empty arrivals in 10 minutes from a station not on the map would make a normal person pick up a phone. It made me do what night shift does when a machine uses the wrong word twice. I went to go watch it say the wrong thing the third time. The tube troubleshooting binder lives under the console like a dictionary nobody uses for spelling anymore. I tucked it under my arm out of superstition and because night shift loves props. The console printed, 113, route start, Lab, 01 Ortho 01, as if to reassure me that this time it understood its own grammar. There's a sound the tube makes when it wants to be helpful. It's almost human, a long draw and a short release, as if the building remembered how to sigh. I stood close enough to the Lab, 01 throat to feel the draft. It was subtle, like standing by a cracked window. The carrier the console had blessed with a route start was the same one from 10 minutes ago. I'd left it in the cradle. I nearly put my hand over it like you might over a baby's eyes when a flash goes off in a dark room. The cradle gave a small jerk the way a dog gives a small jerk when it thinks it heard its name 3 houses over. The carrier didn't leave. The route complete that should have followed didn't. Instead, 114, cancel, timeout, Ortho-01 not available. In telecom, Lorna hates when people use ghost for devices that are simply misconfigured. Lorna is the adult in the room. I called her anyway. Map shows Ortho as out, she said before hello had finished being hello. I could hear the white noise of the switch behind her voice. Breakers off. Controller sees the station as red. If you're getting an arrive, it's a misaddressed tag. Each carrier has an RFID puck inside the lid, older ones an acrylic lens with a barcode sole. If the system guesses wrong, the map will spit a carrier somewhere familiar like a dog dropping shoes in the kitchen when it can't find a leash. Bring the lid down and I'll read it, she said. We'll see who it thinks it is. Something moved in the ceiling over the corridor like a hand on a spine. That's how it sounds when a diverter flips photograph fast and then decides it meant the previous shape. I felt the draft again. The console printed, 120, arrive, lab, 01, Ortho-01. Third time, I said to nobody and then to the ceiling, because night shift says things out loud to keep them true. I popped the lid off the carrier and stared at the puck. The sticker said 17, North, or back one in blocky font, orphan from a previous life. The puck itself took up most of my palm and did not care what the sticker wanted. I took it down to telecom where Lorna scanned it with a reader that made a sound like a grocery store pretending it's magic. Her screen showed a code that wasn't in the map. This is not a lid I know, she said softly. Or rather, it is one we lost when the annex stations were replaced. The map thinks this tag is retired. She scrolled. Last recorded send on this lid. I'm not reading that to you right now. You got the same feeling I did. You feel your eyebrows rise but your hands stay the same temperature. I nodded at nothing and at Lorna too. Back at lab 01, the carrier lay open like a mouth after a joke. The felt ring around the cap showed a new crescent of grime, smaller than the first. A thread, blue painter's tape, clung to the felt like a hair. The tube is not haunted. The tube is pipes and vacuum pumps and diverters that don't care about your shift. I carried the carrier to the service elevator because whatever was happening wanted to happen at 8th floor North Annex Ortho-01, a place that is not there. The elevator came obediently when I pressed the big square button and watched itself be useful. The ride up has its own rhythm when the building is mostly asleep, 2, 3, 4 goes fast, 5, 6, 7 slows as a counterweight remembers its knees, 8 thinks for a heartbeat and then lets you off politely. North Annex 8 had the taped-off quiet of a room that knew where all the furniture would be in a month but wasn't allowed to tell. The orbits of work lights pooled like moons in freshly waxed halls. Static clung to my forearms where the poly overlapped itself across doorways. The tube station by the Ortho nurse's alcove had its faceplate hanging by one screw like a yawning mouth. The station address label, Ortho-01, was still in its little slot, the letters fox gray around their edges like an old Bible. There was no power to the proximity sensor around the throat. A bit of painter's tape with Singh's handwriting, "Do not energize," drooped. The elbow diverter above the ceiling tile made a sound like someone pressing knuckles into wood and dragging lightly. Not a knock. A slow worry. You do not reach into a station throat on a floor that should be asleep, not even when you're young enough to feel invincible, so I did not. I did what night shift does when it wants the building to know you aren't trying to be clever. I said out loud, lab, at Ortho. Station appears de-energized. Investigating. My radio answered with hail from security saying, copy. I'm on 8 for a stairwell door test. Want me? I wanted her the way a person wants a human in a hallway that has too much plastic. Yeah, I said, and my voice did the honest thing and shook once because fear feels better if it finds the air. Hale appeared like a habitable idea, keys ratcheting against her belt the way keys talk when they're not performing. She looked at the station, at the tape, at my carrier on the floor by my foot. If it's dead, how is it talking? She asked the way a person asks a stove why it burns soup. I took a breath that tasted like lemon wax and glue. There's a bypass loop that feeds past this floor on its way to NICU. If the diverter is stuck, a carrier could roll past and the pressure change might. The station exhaled. That's not right. Stations inhale, that's how they earn their living. But the throat gave air, a short, cool gust that carried a smell I know and will never be good at explaining, the wet metal smell of operating room drapes just before a case starts, the mouth of a freezer as it's opened when the cooler mist rubs your shins, the scent of a half-dry mop abandoned because someone called your name. The throat exhaled and the painter's tape lifted like a flag. Hale stepped back because she is not stupid. The console downstairs chirped on my radio like a delayed laugh. 131, arrive, Lab 01, Ortho-01. We stood without talking the way people stand without talking when a room is telling them not to. I set the empty carrier under the station throat the same way you might set a glass under a faucet you don't trust. The throat inhaled again, more properly this time, and the station made the small sound empty hallways make when they remember they are connected to other hallways. The carrier rattled as if someone had dropped a coin 3 rooms away. I put a hand on its lid and felt cooler air pull around my fingers and the faint, delicate jump of a vacuum pump trying to be agreeable through tape and wire nuts and well-intended tags. The station did nothing but breathe. On the radio, the printer by my console complained a neat complaint into the little mic that picks up its life, printing. I wanted to see what it had written the way children want to run back downstairs when the dog barks. Hale saw the want move across my face and nodded. I've got this if this has me, she said. It meant, go. It also meant, don't run. Downstairs the lab smelled like someone had argued with coffee and lost. The console had been generous with its paper. The last 4 entries were identical except for their minutes, arrive, Lab 01, Ortho-01. Empty arrival. Empty arrival. Empty arrival. The timestamps were neat, 054, 104, 120, 131. If you grew up making medpass times by heart, noon, 4, 8, their neatness looks like a superstition you don't put your name on. The 5th line, though, that line I wasn't ready for, 133, route start, NICU 02 Lab 01, override by user 0000. Nobody was at NICU 02. NICU sends tubes all the time, but not at 133 out of nowhere, and not with an override that looks like the default value of a field nobody should ever see. I scanned the NICU camera from security's multiplex so I would not have to ask my legs to do the stairs, nobody at the window, nobody bumping a carrier with their hip, nobody with that NICU look on their face nurses get when they have to send blood and hope. The carriage time on the console stayed blank and then decided to live, 135, arrive, Lab 01, NICU 02. Carrier in the cradle. Lid kissed tight. No gouges in this one, just a ring scuffed to a pearl. I popped it and the lid sighed the freezer sigh again and I was certain I knew what I would see and of course I am not old enough to know anything. Inside, a folded requisition with a patient sticker half peeled like someone had changed their mind, a paperclip just beginning to rust, a dot matrix lab slip printed in a font that has been retired in favor of fonts that do not remember how to clatter. The date on the slip was a decade wrong. The attending name was a name I knew because she left at the end of that decade to teach students how to listen to murmurs with their palms. The test ordered was not a stat. It was a type and scream, steady as a metronome. Who sent this? I asked the air, but I was asking a thing that does not answer. The loudest sound in the room was the paper against my fingertips. I've made the same motion 1,000 times, flattening a requisition to catch a lab light. I held this one in that light like a kid trying to read a map. The dot matrix holes along the left edge still had chads that hadn't been torn clean. The gray line that runs down cheap thermal stock when a printer is bored ran halfway down the right margin. It wasn't damp. It wasn't dusty. It was just, here. Lorna came without me calling because the console calls her when the world needs a librarian. She looked at the carrier, at the slip, at me. She didn't touch the paper. We retired NICU 02's controller in 2017, she said quietly. When we did, we inventoried lids. That barcode lid is in my cabinet. With a crack through the acrylic lens. You picked this one off a cradle with no crack. We like to keep day shift explanations ready for when the day returns. I could already hear them lining up. A stuck diverter cleared a backlog in a bypass loop and a very old carrier took an unkind path home. A renovation disturbed a station the system believes is dead and addressed misread tags to a location a human would know not to use. It isn't that those explanations are wrong. It's that they occupy one layer, and the tube, like all machines and most buildings, likes to stack its layers until the top one feels imagined. Hale came down with my first empty carrier under her arm. It breathed again, then got bored. If boredom has pressure, she said. She looked at the dot matrix slip without touching it and smiled a humorless smile that meant, well then. Do we call facilities for a diverter check or do we call church for a vibe check? We called facilities because we are paid by a hospital and because tools beat candles in rooms with oxygen. By the time Singh arrived with his Pelican case and an expression he saves for night annoyances, the tube had decided to behave politely for one of those long stretches politeness survives under fluorescence. We drank coffee that tasted like steel while Singh took soffit tiles down with a slow rain of plaster dust and made the diverter above lab 01 admit it was not as certain as it had pretended to be. A grubby relay, his word, chattered like a cricket in need of permission. This gate could misroute an empty. That's your arrival, he said, pleased to have put a nail in one layer of wood. But misrouted from where? Lorna asked, because librarians ask better than cops. From an unpowered station, she added to the ceiling. The ceiling did not add to the conversation. We swapped lids, purged lines, sent test carriers like sailors testing a pump with buckets until the whoosh through the tubes fell back into the cadence of a thing that forgives you for waking it. The console printed route complete tidy as bedtime. Singh wrote his name and a fixed number on a piece of yellow tape and made the yellow tape look like a promise. Lorna took the dot matrix slip and the requisition into a clear envelope like evidence at a polite trial and wrote a date on it that matched the date on the console because the day would want that. Here are the details daylight is welcome to. A diverter gate above the lab had oxidation on contacts that could chatter and misread a lid's code. A lid had been mislabeled and miscataloged during a previous modernization and lived in the wrong drawer long enough to teach itself the wrong name. A bypass loop through the annex holds carriers when a jam clears downstream and will occasionally burp one back upstream like a patient remembering a swallowed pill. Here is the detail that isn't daylight's job. All the arrivals that night, including the NICU send, happened on 8s, 4s, and 3s in a pattern that lined up with the old ortho midnight med pass. 054, 104, 120, 131, 133. If you know shifts you can feel the rhythm in your bones the way you feel elevator counterweights. I found an old whiteboard photo in a folder on the shared drive labeled Ortho Nights, where the charge nurse had scrawled med time blocks. The shapes on her board and the marks on my console married without either asking permission. I went home with the smell of lemon wax on my elbow and that freezer mouth cold in the lining of my jacket. When I showered the smell ran forward like a thought I decided not to have. I slept and the tube slept and the building turned its other clock. On my next shift the console behaved perfectly for 3/4 of the night and our riders arrived with lids that wore the right names. It was lately, 3:08, when the console printed a single dry line I folded into my pocket without telling anyone. NICU 02, route start, user 0000. I went to the cradle and picked up an empty carrier whose felt ring had 3 small arcs pressed into it just where your thumb cups the lid. Not scratches. Not gouges. Just worried half-moons that catch a lab light when you decide to see them. That is a silly detail. It helps. Because order belongs to the day and patterns belong to people and the tube belongs to neither. If you work nights, you learn to talk to machines as if they can forgive you. If you work long enough you sometimes hear them answer in drafts and relay clicks and intervals, and the answer is not much more complicated than a person's. The answer is, I remember. I still stand too close to the lab 01 throat when the building quiets itself and the only other sound is the elevator drawing its breath for an empty stop. When the tube sighs like a hallway remembering a door, I put my palms on the edge the way you put your hands on the crown of a child to measure them without a ruler. I say, we're not doing ortho tonight, out loud the way you tell the dog you're coming back. Most nights it says okay. On the ones where it doesn't, a carrier arrives empty and cold and I write the time in the log in block numbers like it matters, and I send a test carrier to NICU just to be sure we still know each other's names. The carrier returns warm, with nothing in it but air and the sound of paper that knows when to rustle and when to keep its own counsel.